Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, the top general in the Middle East talks about the future of the region. The Navy has to choose a priority for its future fiscal planning: destroyer, fighter, or submarine. Find out how it'll make the decision. With the latest news and analysis from the Pentagon's The Platoon, this is Defense News Weekly. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Andrea Scott. We have a great show for you this week, beginning with updates from Afghanistan. The top U.S. commander in the Middle East, Marine General Frank McKenzie, spoke to Military Times this week about the future of the restive region. Talking to managing editor Howard Altman, McKenzie spoke about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Here's some of that interview.
For the past 20 years, U.S. Central Command has been one of the busiest of the U.S. military's regionally aligned headquarters. Things are starting to shift, however, as a greater emphasis on China and Russia. Still, with things bubbling up always in the Middle East, this is going to be a busy command. On June 11th, I spoke via phone to Marine General Kenneth F. McKenzie, the commander of U.S. Central Command. We spoke from his Tampa, Florida headquarters at MacDill Air Force Base on a wide range of topics: the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the future of the interpreters who have helped the U.S. out over all these years, a drone attack in Iraq, and the general future of operations in that part of the world. One of the questions that I asked McKenzie was whether the U.S. would conduct kinetic action against either the Taliban or ISIS-K if Afghan forces were being overrun. What he told me is that the only way the U.S. would take such action is if U.S. national interests were at stake and the Afghan forces could not prevent something bad from happening.
Sure, those are actually, as you will appreciate, Howard, policy decisions, not military decisions. I will tell you this, right now what we're planning to do after we withdraw is keep pressure on Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And that would be what we'd be doing, going back into doing Afghanistan. When those entities presented actionable threats against the United States, we'd be prepared to go in there and take action if our Afghan partners are unable to do that. And that will be the limit of our kinetic actions in Afghanistan.
So you're not ruling out there still could be kinetic actions undertaken by the U.S. under certain circumstances?
I am completely silent on that. I would tell you that the only thing we're planning for right now is the ability to continue operations against Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Would you rule that out?
Yeah, I'm probably not the right guy to ask, Howard.
Recently, there was an attack on the Baghdad Diplomatic Support Center, and I asked McKenzie whether that was a drone strike. He confirmed it and said it showed a greater issue that the region faces with influence from Iran.
The one thing I'll point out is, the actual people who are responsible for defending us there is the government of Iraq. The government of Iraq. And they do a pretty good job of trying to minimize these attacks. They were not successful in this case. And of course, we always retain the ability to defend ourselves wherever we are and under whatever circumstances we are. These attacks are troubling going forward, and what they represent is, for well over the last year and a half, Iran has sought to force us to leave Iraq, and they sought to do that through political means. And so now that they recognize that they're not going to get there politically, they're shifting to a military approach, and that's just where we are right now. And this UAV attack, and I can tell you it was a UAV attack, but I'm really not in a position today to give you much more information on it right now, is representative of that. And so that's concerning to us as we go forward.
Do you anticipate the potential of kinetic action with Iran in Iraq or elsewhere as they ramp these attacks up?
So that's a question probably not for me. That's really a high level decision for the United States that would be made well above the level of U.S. Central Command.
I imagine you have contingencies in case such a situation would arise.
We have contingencies for everything.
One of the lingering questions about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is the fate of the thousands of men and women who served as interpreters and in other functions helping U.S. forces, and now are fearful for their lives as the U.S. is no longer there to protect them. Have you presented plans to SecDef yet for evacuating the interpreters if so tasked? Can you share those plans? And then what is your message to those people who are waiting? Have you presented the plans yet to SecDef?
So we have workable plans to evacuate any scale of people that would be directed to do. It's one of the things that we've done. I've talked to the Secretary about it. The actual decision about who's going to come out, whether they would come out, and how they would work, that's not a Department of Defense decision. That's a Department of State decision. Ultimately, at a level above the Department of State. I can tell you this. The Department of Defense is prepared to undertake any task that we would be required to do in coordination with a presidential decision.
What's your message for those who worked with the U.S. and risked their lives and are now waiting?
Well, I certainly value those Afghans I've worked with, and down through the years I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of them too. I would say this: now is a time when it is incumbent upon Afghans to defend their country, and this is going to be a stern test for them. I think they're going to enter a period of grave risk now, but I think it is they can defend their country. It's not going to be easy, but they can certainly do that.
As the U.S. military looks to shift emphasis to counter influence by China and Russia, one thing remains clear. The Middle East will always be a restive and dangerous area, and the U.S. Central Command will continue to play a key role in U.S. military operations. For Military Times, this is Managing Editor Howard Altman.
And that's it from Around the Services this week. When we come back, the Navy looks to pick a lane for funding in coming years, and South Korean shipbuilders unveil their carrier designs.
A ship, a jet, or a sub? Which would you pick? The Navy has to choose advancing just one right away because of budget limitations. Defense News Naval Warfare reporter Megan Eckstein breaks down the decision in this week's Actionable Intelligence.
Navy Secretary Thomas Harker recently signed out a FY 2023 memo just very early in the budget planning process for the next upcoming fiscal year. But basically his understanding of the fiscal situation is that the Navy won't have any great increases in its funding levels, and therefore there are three major upcoming modernization projects. And in his assessment, he believes the Navy will only be able to really prioritize one of the three. That's not to say the other two will be canceled, but the Navy needs to pick one of three upcoming projects, which are DDG-X, the Navy's next destroyer program, SSN-X, which is the Navy's next attack submarine program, and Next Generation Air Dominance, which is the Navy's next fighter jet program. All three of these, just by circumstance, are in early phases of development right now. They originally were on different timelines, but have kind of found themselves bundled together, and the Navy's worried that with a flat budget projection coming up for fiscal year 2023, that they will only be able to fully prioritize one of the three programs. Currently, the Navy uses its Arleigh Burke class destroyer. It's gone through several iterations of design. It was originally a design taken from the Ticonderoga class cruisers, which is the Navy's big surface combatant. It has a lot of missile cells. It has a big radar. It's basically meant to go out, patrol the ocean surface, see incoming air threats, see incoming surface threats, and have the offensive capability and defensive capability to take out any targets. Sometimes they're used to protect the aircraft carrier, sometimes they're used to go out on individual patrols. So ultimately, while the Navy is happy with the current Flight 3 design of the Arleigh Burke class destroyer, they need something next, which is where originally Future Surface Combatant, then it became DDG Next, now it's DDG-X, but ultimately this new program will be the next large surface combatant the Navy fields. It's expected to have a larger radar in the future to see more and more complex threats, such as incoming hypersonic weapons. It's meant to carry larger weapons, which could include hypersonic weapons. It's also meant to have the electrical capacity for things like directed energy, laser weapons, jamming capabilities, and really the Navy just can't accommodate all of those needs with the current Arleigh Burke class platform. So DDG-X will take the Navy sort of to the next level of being able to have defensive and offensive capabilities in a surface combatant. In the late 1990s, the Navy began designing and fielding the Virginia-class attack submarine. At the time, there wasn't a major submarine threat, and so the focus of the Virginia program was on a lower-cost attack submarine. It could be stealthy, it could get into shallow waters near a shoreline, it could focus on land attack missions, which is to say it could sneak in towards an enemy coastline, launch Tomahawk land attack missiles at a land threat. And that was the primary focus of the Virginia-class design. Now, everything is different for the Navy submarine community. Not much of a focus on land attack, and a much greater focus on finding Russian submarines, for example, finding adversary submarines under the water, going after adversary surface ships, and kind of lurking underneath. This SSN-X submarine would need to go faster, it would need to have a much greater payload capacity, it would need to have, more weapons on board, for example. It might need to have different weapons on board, for example, if the Navy is looking at longer ranges that they want to be operating in. It may or may not need the capacity to interact with unmanned vessels, which is something new the Navy is experimenting with in the undersea domain. While they could make incremental upgrades, the Navy is looking at something entirely different in the way they want to operate the attack submarine fleet. They're looking at a different mission set, they're looking at a different enemy, and really they're looking to evolve beyond the Virginia platform and into something very different. The Navy currently has a blend of 4th generation and 5th generation fighter jets in its inventory. The 4th generation aircraft is the Super Hornet. The Navy is actually experiencing somewhat of a readiness challenge with the Super Hornets. They're going through and extending the life of several of them and adding capability at the same time in the hopes of having a very capable 4th generation fighter jet out through the mid-2030s. At the same time, they're buying the new F-35C carrier variant of the Joint Strike Fighter, which is the 5th generation fighter jet, increased stealth, increased electronic warfare and jamming capabilities, increased communication with the entire rest of the fleet to collect and share data with ships, with Marines on the ground, with the entire joint force. So the Navy is really hoping to continue having this 4th gen, 5th gen blend out through the 2030s. At that point, the Super Hornets, despite the life extensions that they're going through now, will be phased out of the fleet. The Navy's plans for future operations really emphasize undersea warfare. So when you look at which of the 3 programs they may be more inclined to want to keep on track and to fully fund, SSN-X, the Future Attack Submarine, may win out in the sense that future operational plans call for a larger attack submarine force and really emphasize the need for underwater capabilities, undersea warfare, associated sensors and unmanned vehicles. That's really an emphasis in Navy future operational plans, and so that may give SSN-X, the Future Attack Submarine, a leg up on the other 2.
Thanks, Megan. And now for defense industry headlines. 2 shipbuilders have each displayed their conceptual designs for the South Korean Navy's Future Light Aircraft Carrier. That's codenamed CVX. Models were displayed in Korea at the Maritime Defense Industry Exhibition, or MADEX, on June 9th. Hyundai Heavy Industries is proposing a carrier with an optional ski jump ramp that could be removed to accept a catapult. The carrier would also support vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, as well as drones. Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering showed its CVX proposal, which offers a flight deck-based carrier featuring an anti-drone defense system. On the first day of MADEX, the shipbuilders signed a memorandum of understanding with Italy's Fincantieri to assist with the conceptual design for the CVX project. The U.S. Army selected 2 companies to design and build prototype sensors for its next-generation airborne intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance system. That's according to a June 11 announcement. The Army awarded other transaction authority contracts on June 11th to both L3 Communications Integrated Systems and Raytheon Applied Signal Technology. The OTA agreements, subject to less stringent competitive requirements to speed up prototyping, are valued at $4.37 million over an 8-month period in Phase 1, but the overall project could ultimately net the companies $49 million during the life of the project. And that's it in industry news this week. When we return, personal finance expert Jeanette Mack will give you tips for getting out of the rent cycle and buying a home.
On this edition of Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack gives tips on getting into the home buying market.
Trying to buy a home in a tight housing market can make it hard to escape the rent cycle. But it doesn't mean that finding your dream home is out of reach. So the first thing to do is relax and know that you can and will be a homeowner. Next, you need to partner with an experienced real estate agent. They'll know the lay of the land, be able to spot potential homes more quickly, and help negotiate the deal, which is vital when competing against other buyers. Now you need a lender you can trust to get an accurate picture of how much house you can afford. Get pre-approved for your mortgage loan so you can show sellers you're serious about buying and stand out from the other potential buyers. In a tight market, you may have to compromise on some things you want, but be sure you have a firm grasp on what you're unwilling to live without in your new home. Above all, be flexible and be patient. Your new home is just around the corner.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. For more of our coverage, check out our headlines online at Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps Times.com and DefenseNews.com, or navigate on over to our social pages on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. To get military and defense headlines in your inbox every weekday, subscribe to our Early Bird Brief. And check out our upcoming live events at defensenews.com/events. And when we come back, the Military Times editors team breaks down this week's top stories. Welcome back. In this week's Reporters Roundtable, an effort to boost pay for Guard and Reserve troops, and a tussle on Capitol Hill over military wokeness. The Military Times team of editors has more.
It is a very simple question. Should a member of the organization you lead be treated differently, in violation of the Constitution, I would add, based on their sex or the color of their skin?
No, I do not believe that, and that is
Okay.
why we have diversity, equity, and inclusion focus in the military.
Welcome to the Military Times Reporters Roundtable, where we bring you the inside news behind the headlines in the military community each week. I'm Leo Shane, Capitol Hill Bureau Chief for Military Times. With me again this week are Megan Myers, our Pentagon Bureau Chief, and Howard Altman, our Managing Editor. Thanks to both of you for joining in. I wanted to do something a little different this week, take a deeper dive into a story that we've covered. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Milley have been up on the Hill numerous times in recent weeks, talking to Congress about the budget, talking about Afghanistan. But I wanted to zero in on a recent appearance before the Senate Armed Services Committee in recent days, just to cover some of the headlines that I think didn't get as much public attention as those other ones. So, Megan, I know you've been writing a lot and focused a lot on this issue of how the military is going to prosecute sexual assaults moving ahead. We've had a lot of discussion about this in recent years, whether or not sexual assault cases, sexual harassment should be taken out of the chain of command, whether there should be an independent prosecutor who handles these. Where do things stand now? Because it seems like there's some really big changes on the way.
So the Pentagon stood up an independent review commission to look at this issue. They gave their first set of recommendations in April, and one of those was to take sexual assaults out of the chain of command, as well as sexual harassments and some hate crimes. That was their recommendation. And since then, Austin has gotten feedback from all of the service chiefs and the service secretaries, and is now mulling his final recommendations that he'll make to the president. What has changed recently is there's been more rhetoric around, okay, maybe we look at sexual assaults and sexual harassments and hate crimes. We're open to that idea. But on the Hill, the direction has moved very rapidly to supporting Senator Kirsten Gillibrand's bill, which would take a lot more high-level offenses, a lot of felonies out of the chain of command as well, murders, larceny, things like that. And that is something that the Defense Department is starting to push back on a little in testimony last week. Again, the secretary said, I'm open to this idea for sexual assault and sexual harassment because I think we've lost the trust of the troops on those. But I am, I'm reticent to throw every high-level crime into that bin and to take those out of the chain of command.
It's pretty astounding to see just how far the conversation has shifted, though. I mean, there was a lot of opposition to this idea of taking the sexual misconduct crimes out, and now we're talking about a much broader scope even, and it appears there's support for this on Capitol Hill. So, I mean, just how will the military deal with this if that's what they're served with?
I mean, if that's what they're served with, if that bill passes and the president signs it, then that is what it is, and they will, the JAG Corps will have to stand up some of these teams that will be trained on making these decisions, and then it will no longer be commanders who, levy charges and decide whether something goes to court-martial. They'll of course figure it out, but I think they're going to make a pretty strong case, until the last minute to not do it this way, to just piecemeal take a few crimes out of the chain of command. And see how that goes.
Okay, another issue they're going to have to figure out deals with Guard and Reserve pay. Howard, I know you were following this. It came up in the hearing, the issue of just whether or not these part-time troops are getting paid for equitable work. We've seen a lot of cases where Guardsmen and Reservists have been mobilized, working alongside active duty folks, and getting different specialty pays, getting different hazard duty pays, things like that. Now the Pentagon's saying they'll look into it. How big of a deal is this?
Well, it's a huge deal, Leo. You have to remember, for a lot of these part-time troops, this hasn't been a part-time job. If you look back to the start of the pandemic, there were about 120,000 National Guard troops mobilized for that. Then there were thousands of troops mobilized for civil unrest, and then 26,000 Guard troops came to Washington, D.C. in the wake of the January 6th insurrection to protect the inauguration of Joe Biden. That's on top of 3,500 Guard troops who have been at the border and will be probably till September. And now it's June, it's hurricane season again. So that this has been a very extraordinary, busy time for folks who, in many cases, signed up for part-time duty. And because of the way things have rolled out, because of a lot of paperwork and bureaucracy, folks are not getting the same pay and benefits that they would is with the regular active duty troops. So General Mark Milley, the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that the Pentagon is looking into this. They've have a commission working on this to find a way to have more equality between the Guard and Reserve and the active duty troops. And they've got a long way to go to make that happen.
Okay. One more issue from that Senate Armed Services Committee hearing that came up. There was a pretty testy exchange between Senator Tom Cotton and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin over the issue of racial equality, racial parity in the military. Megan, you wrote about this. Break down what was happening.
So basically goes back a year ago after George Floyd was murdered, and the response throughout the country, and commensurately the response in the military, among service members of color who have felt those same pressures, that any Black person in America feels. And so during the last administration, some working groups and some studies were done about diversity and inclusion in the military, and that has carried through to this administration. And then a new facet was added after January 6th, when it became clear that not only were there current service members who were at the riot on the Capitol, but there were a lot of veterans, a lot of people who had served. And that really pricked the military's ears up to maybe we have an issue with, latent extremism in the ranks, or with our veterans being recruited into these extremist groups, and we need to tackle that. And it kind of came to a head with Senator Tom Cotton and the Defense Secretary last week.
Mr. Secretary, do you believe that our military is a fundamentally racist organization? Yes or no, please.
Well, I won't give you a yes or no answer on that, Senator, because it deserves more than a yes or no. The military, like any organization, will have its challenges, but I do not believe it is a fundamentally racist organization.
Thank you. I'm sorry to cut you off, but our time is limited. I think it is a pretty simple question. I'm glad that you agree it is not fundamentally racist.
It was pretty shocking to see, these very complex questions, right, that need a lot of explanation, just boil down to these yes or no points, and nobody really got anywhere.
Well, one last thing before we go. I'm looking through my notes here and realized that we missed the Army's birthday last week, 246th birthday. So, Megan, what did you buy for the Army to celebrate?
What did I buy from the Army to celebrate? You know, I raised a glass. I raised a seltzer to the Army birthday. It's, you know, the service it predates America actually, so they've got that going for them.
Howard, did you at least send a card or something? Come on, man.
Well, I just moved back to DC and I found some of my lovely coins here. The 101st, and it's the 260th birthday. So it's the 240th birthday. So this was a few years ago. So got my collection. Go Army.
All right.
Yeah,
Well, look, we'll try and do better for the other services as they come up. Thanks to both my colleagues for joining us this week, and thanks to you for watching. Remember that you can follow all the biggest news in the military community all week long at militarytimes.com. We'll see you next time.
And that's all we have time for this week. Please visit us on militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more coverage. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.